Welcome to Secret Art of Spacetime, a podcast about ideas, culture, and spirituality. My name is Andy. I hope you enjoy this show. So we are right in between the two eclipses as I'm recording. There was a total lunar eclipse in Pisces on September 7th. And a partial solar eclipse in Virgo on September 21st. I often feel eclipse seasons like it almost feels like being wrung out like a rag. I think that makes sense because eclipses are so much about release. You know, eclipses are notoriously unpredictable, predictably unpredictable. If you think about the symbolism of an eclipse, like think of even how we use the word eclipse. Something is eclipsed out, right? Something is released. There's a disconnect, right? When the light of the moon or the light of the sun is blocked, there's something we can't see, something that's released, something that's eclipsed out. And so even though we may not want to do kind of manifestation magic, let's say, there is an opportunity to work with eclipse seasons intentionally through intentionally releasing. So this could be releasing modes of thought, ways of being. It could be an emotional release. It could be something more physical. Maybe there's some aspect of your life, a person, a place, a thing, a pattern that's being released or asking to be released. So the Virgo Pisces eclipse series began in 2024, September of 2024, so a year ago, and goes until 2027. February 2027 is the last of the Pisces Virgo eclipses. So we're not just in the middle of this eclipse season, but we're in the middle of this bigger span of the Pisces Virgo eclipse series. So whatever is asking for release, it may not happen, exactly on one of the eclipses or even exactly during eclipse season. Although the themes are likely to be more potent and obvious and felt right now during eclipse season. You can always get more information as to where in your life the eclipses are working by looking at the houses in your birth chart in which the eclipses fall. So during this span of time, right, 2024 to 2027, but there's a particular focus on it right now, this month, there's an opportunity. It's more than an opportunity in a way. It's like when we don't participate with it, often it happens anyway. Like there's something about eclipses that seem almost fated. Like often they correspond to themes in our life where, yes, we can willingly and intentionally collaborate with what's happening, but to some extent, often it's out of our hands. Another reason that magic is not always aligned with eclipses because sometimes there's the temptation through magic to try and control, whereas eclipses are often about aspects of our life that are beyond our control, that are bigger than us, that may be fated or that may just in some ways not be relevant to the ego self. It may be something that we're involved with on a soul level and our ego self, wants to be in control, wants to, cling to how things were or have been. Change is really hard often for the ego, for the part of us that thinks it's who we really are, So what are your emotions telling you? What is surfacing now that you may be tempted to repress or deny or ignore, but is simply the truth? Eclipses help us to, in some ways, refine the polarities. So in this case, the Pisces Virgo polarity is asking for refinement, and refinement over this 2-year period where certain modes of relating to those signs must be released, must be eclipsed out in order that there can be a better balance. So with North Node in Pisces, South Node in Virgo, right, we're refining how we work with this polarity. Each sign needs its opposite. So the imbalance of a sign shows up when it's completely disconnected from its opposite. So the imbalance of Virgo, and particularly South Node in Virgo, occurs when it's utterly disconnected from Pisces. So this can show up as the attempt to control, right? The desire to control everything, being overly fixated on details, right? Missing the forest by focusing only on the trees. It can be a perfectionism, right? Virgo in its imbalanced form as disconnected from Pisces can be perfectionism. It can be the paralysis that comes from trying to get it right, trying to get it perfect. It can be judgmentalness, right? So Virgo in its balanced form is discernment, right? So every spiritual truth can appear paradoxical, and because of that appearance, before we understand it as a truth, we can be almost repelled from it by the appearance of paradox. So what I mean by that is, in this case, the paradox appears to be the duality of either we are judgmental and discerning, or we are, right, the imbalanced Pisces, or we are undiscerning and loving and forgiving. And it's either or. But the seeming paradox, which is the truth of the integration of the Pisces Virgo polarity, is that it's entirely possible to release, to eclipse out judgmentalness, but to keep discernment. That's one of the highest potentials of the integration of Pisces and Virgo is discernment, clear sight, right? Seeing ethically, but without judgmentalness. Judgment rather than judgmentalness. So integrating the Pisces unconditional love, complete forgiveness, but still being discerning, Virgo. So we can see if someone is, say, immature or spiritually misguided. We can see that without judging them. We can see clearly what is right and true and good. We can see our path forward. We can see, if someone's behaving in a way where we maybe want some kind of a boundary, maybe we don't want to allow them more into our lives, but we can do that without being judgmental. So to the quote unquote uninitiated, let's say, right? Before we have an experience of that spiritual truth, right? Before we know it in our bones, it appears to be impossible. It appears to be a binary of either we're judgmental or we're loving. Or it probably doesn't even show up in that form. It probably shows up as we must be judgmental in order to be discerning. But that's not true. I was talking with a friend about this the other day, and he was having a hard time wrapping his mind around it. And I was reminded of an essay that I read a long time ago, back when I was studying science and having a hard time myself wrapping my mind around spirituality. And yet I had had some experiences that sort of pushed me into trying to make sense of spirituality, even while, still studying science, still, thinking in a very scientific way. and I read this essay by William James called The Will to Believe. And I actually looked this essay up the other day, and it's just like so wordy in such an annoying way. But I think the argument is the key thing. And so the argument he makes is that you can approach spirituality in a scientific way through holding a spiritual truth as a hypothesis. So in this case, we could hold the idea that it is possible to release judgmentalness while still maintaining discernment. But William James says the interesting thing about spirituality is that in order to test the hypothesis, you have to be willing to first believe it, even if you hold that belief tentatively, experimentally, right? Because spirituality is about belief and worldview and psychology in a way, we have to be willing to believe something in order to test it, right? In order to be scientific, we actually have to be willing to take on the belief to see what happens. So if you're someone who, like I was at one point, rather skeptical and not wanting to be sort of, like led down the garden path or something, you could try this, right? You could hold this idea experimentally as a hypothesis, as a belief that you try on to see what happens. Maybe you take a month, maybe you say for the next month, I'm going to see what happens if I try to walk around the world without being judgmental. Just see what happens for you. And it's not an easy thing to do. Like, I think meditation is extremely helpful for this because meditation can help us to be in a mode where we're simply perceiving, right? We're still discerning, we're still noticing the details, right? Very Virgo. But without that added layer of good or bad, right? So it can begin even in the simplest way through observing the breath, observing sensations in the body, noticing what's there without judging it, right? There's often the automatic judgment that comes. There's a little bit of pain in the body, and automatically the mind starts to judge it and think it's bad. That's normal, right? But what happens when we can really meditate and simply observe the pain without loading this judgment and the potential narratives that come onto it? What if we can simply stay with the sensation, with the truth of the present moment? That is the integration of Virgo Pisces. Presence, pure presence without judgment. And if we can do that in meditation with sensations that arise in the body and with our thoughts as well, right? Can we even witness our own thought patterns without judging them? And, something that trips a lot of people up when they first begin to meditate is their own judgment of their process of meditation, not realizing that that's actually taking them out of the process of meditation. So it's very common for people to meditation's not easy. So let's say you're counting your breaths and it's very difficult. You can count 2 breaths and then, 10 minutes later, you realize you've been down some rabbit hole of thought. Now, when you notice that you've been off on some thought tangent and not observing your breath, this is the key moment. What do you do in that moment? Often when people are newer to meditation, they notice and then they immediately start berating themselves for how bad they are at meditation. But it's that moment of noticing that you've been off on some thought tangent. That noticing is meditation. As soon as you notice, you're present. The noticing that you've been thinking is meditation. Whereas when we go into this judgmental mode of, oh, I'm so bad at meditating, I hate this, blah, 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 that's actually going backwards. Every time you notice that you've been off on some thought tangent, even if it's been for 10 minutes, even if it's been for half an hour, that's cause for celebration. You are meditating in that moment. You are present in that moment. How can we notice when we've been off track and not then continue to go off track by building some narrative and some self-judgment around that, but simply by being present in that moment and saying, okay, I've been off track, but now I'm on track. Now I'm present again. Now I'm with my breath again. So meditation is one of the most potent modalities for refining this way of thinking, for releasing the judgmental mode. And some people might say, why should we release judgmentalness? Like, a lot of people are very identified with their own judgmentalness. And obviously it's your choice. You can stay being judgmental if you wish. But what I'm suggesting is that judgmentalness actually is one of the key blocks to embodying spirituality. Judgmentalness is one of the Virgo imbalances. The reverse imbalance, the Piscean imbalance, when Pisces is disconnected from Virgo, is the confusion that arises from a lack of discernment. It's the naive spirituality, the unintegrated spirituality of all is love, all is one, everything's okay, everything's perfect. I don't need to do anything. I don't need to decide anything. Everything's all right. I don't need boundaries either, right? It can be overly open. There can be a lack of discipline, right? Like, I don't need to meditate because everything is perfect as it already is. And again, we get the spiritual paradox because there is a way in which everything is perfect as it is. From a higher perspective, from God's perspective, let's say, everything is perfect as it is. But here on the ground, in a body, in form, things aren't always perfect. And both those things are true simultaneously. We can see from a zoomed out perspective that even pain and difficulty and trauma might be a way in which we find balance, in which we learn, in which we come into greater compassion and greater love. But it would be certainly lacking in compassion to say to someone who is suffering that it's perfect as it is. That's a lack of discernment. That's a Piscean confusion. A Piscean confusion might say, to be loving means to be open to everyone. And so if this person's talking to me, I have to keep talking to them, even if I don't want to, right? No boundaries. The confusion of love means no boundaries. That's wrong. Love requires boundaries. The more open-hearted we are, the more we need boundaries. The more we need discernment. Sometimes a boundary is the most loving thing you can do, not just for yourself, but for the other person too. Another Piscean imbalance is the confusion of the inability to discern between delusion and intuition. Psychic insight can look very similar to delusion. So again, we need to integrate Virgo discernment as well as practice. You know, Virgo loves practice and spiritual discipline and psychic development. These things all take work. Work which can allow the Piscean intuition and psychic ability to be refined so that we can discern between psychic insight and delusion, confusion. So Virgo has to do with the everyday, the mundane aspects of life, chores, routine, what we do on a day-to-day basis, what we have to do in a way. Our obligations is not quite the right word, but like our duties, our chores, our tasks, our to-do list, you know, that's all very Virgoan, it's all very Virgo. And again, when Virgo is disconnected from Pisces, it can just feel like a chore. It can feel very boring. It can feel like every day is the same. I'm just going through the motions, trying to get it right? Being judgmental of everyone who's not as on top of their to-do list as I am, right? But when Virgo is integrated with Pisces, right, where Pisces is spiritual experience, embodied spiritual truth, the opposite of the mundane, right? It's transcendence, right? It's the feeling of being connected with everything, with the all, with God, right? Why Pisces often can be also in its unintegrated form connected with addiction, and particularly alcohol and opiates, because there's this Piscean desire to feel that oceanic interconnectedness with all that is. And we don't always know how to do that. So sometimes alcohol is our way. It's a stand-in for a actual connection with God. But when Pisces and Virgo are integrated, there's the potential for spiritual embodiment in the everyday. Yes, we make space for our spiritual practices, but we begin more and more to see that every single aspect of life is miraculous, is an aspect of the divine. You know, even while doing the dishes or whatever it is, every single moment holds the potential for realization of God, or however you want to put it, right? For feeling that interconnectedness with all that is, for sensing the divine, for operating in an intuitive way, for operating from true love, even while going about our errands or our tasks. We often have to go through a period of kind of swinging between one or the other before we can truly find the integration. So it's normal that we have to at times retreat, right, into the Pisces energy. Maybe we need to take a few days and go to a cabin in the woods. Maybe we read poetry or listen to music and really go into the Piscean mode. And then we swing back into the Virgo mode, back into daily life, back into the routine. But how can we more and more bring these two together so that we feel the magic in every single moment in our day-to-day life? We have to release the aspects of Virgo that are overly controlling, overly picky, overly judgmental, and yet honor the incredible beauty of Virgoan refinement, discernment, attention to detail, desire for improvement. So Virgo's penchant for improvement and perfection, when unintegrated with Pisces, right, can lead to perfectionism, can lead to this sort of like self-improvement mode of like, I'm never good enough. There's always more work to be done. But integrated with Pisces, it can be a desire for improvement while simultaneously recognizing that we are complete as we are. Both of those are true. Again, the seeming paradox. How can we embody complete acceptance, complete self-love, exactly as we are, and yet still desire to improve? It is possible to do both of those at the same time. Here's an idea that can trip a Virgo up. Perfectionism is not perfect. Right? If a Virgo really can't release the idea of perfection, it might be helpful for them to perceive perfection as involving imperfection. Like, there's nothing perfect about striving for perfection because that trips us up. That gets in the way of living a good life, of being the best we can be, of creating. Most of us know that perfectionism blocks creativity. It blocks work even. Perfectionism is not perfect. So if you can't release perfect, then re-perceive perfectionism as imperfect. That's for the Virgos out there, or people with strong Virgo placements. So again, Virgo is unintegrated, will feel like there's always more to improve. It's never enough, and particularly the spiritual life is a constant uphill climb, We'll never get there, like enlightenment or whatever, quote unquote, enlightenment is something always in the future, probably even in a future lifetime. It's so far away. There are mountains to climb before we could ever achieve that. But Pisces knows that enlightenment, so-called, is right here. It's only ever in the present. And it does not require us to be perfect or different from how we are. Satori is always available in every moment, no matter who we are, no matter how much we've been judged or judged ourselves. The quote-unquote kingdom of God is available to us in every moment, right here and right now. And that's the only time and place that it's available. It's not available in the future. It's not available in the past. It's only available here. For us to access it requires that we release perfectionism, judgmentalness, control. It requires the Piscean surrender and acceptance and unconditional love. That's the doorway to literal bliss, which does not deny the truth of hardship or pain or suffering. All of that is allowed in because all of that is, potentially true of the present moment. So it's the acceptance of whatever is arising right here and now, even if it's painful or difficult. But the full acceptance of it and surrender to it opens the doors of perception, so to speak, to the transcendent reality, which is not truly transcendent, but integrated and embodied here and now on earth in the body. So there really is an opportunity for some of us, if we wish, if we say yes, to experience literal heaven, to embody spiritual truth right now. And this eclipse series can help us to eclipse out what is standing in the way of that. You don't actually need to learn more or be better in order to embody the altered state of spiritual truth. Quote unquote enlightenment, quote unquote the kingdom of God. However we say it, we're so used to perceiving those things as impossible for us, as so far off, as like we would have to have a real big ego in order to think that that could possibly be for us. But all that kind of dialogue is standing in the way of love. It's standing in between us and God. Now, part of the refinement of the Piscean energy is learning to trust ourselves and our intuition and our path without falling into delusion, and yet releasing the confusion, the feeling of, I don't know, I don't know what's right for me. There's so many options. I have this sort of intuitive sense, but I'm not really sure. I need to seek outside of myself for the answers. And yes, there are all kinds of teachers and modalities and guides who can help us, but truly they can only help us by helping us to connect into our own knowing, because that's truly the spiritual path. Spirituality never lies outside of us. It's always about coming home to the self and our own knowing. So for some of us who are ready, there's an opportunity now to release that sense of confusion, to simply trust that actually I do know. And sometimes my knowing isn't crisp and clear, and that's part of my knowing too, because sometimes when we're trying to intuit into something and there isn't a clear path, we don't know how to decide something. Sometimes that is our intuition telling us that it's not yet time for the decision, or we need more information. So even the sense of not knowing can be our intuitive knowing. Sometimes we are supposed to be in a period of pause. Sometimes when we feel blocked or stuck, it's actually because our intuition is asking us to slow down, to pause, to rest, to not decide. So even indecision can be intuitive. Trust that when you need to know, you will know. Trust that when the time is right, the path will be clear. Trust that even confusion is part of your intuitive knowing. And this, of course, requires great discernment, because there's also obviously the potential for denial, for repression, for thinking that someone else's expectation for us is our own knowing, right? So again, integrating the Virgoan discernment, spiritual practice, the refinement, the learning that comes through trial and error around discerning what is intuition and what is delusion. All of that Virgoan effort, right, when integrated with Pisces, can allow us to make this move when the time is right to release confusion and doubt and trust. Really trust ourselves, trust our own knowing. So this is available for some of us now, and it's more likely to be more available for those of us who've been on a spiritual path, because we've done that Virgoan work of putting in the effort of, learning our intuition through trial and error, right? Through the trial and error of feeling like, I think this is what my intuition is telling me. I'm going to go down this path, and then I'm going to learn through the feedback how better to listen to what is truly intuitive, right? So that kind of work, the work of psychic development, which takes time and effort, the work of learning about spirituality, the work of engaging in our practices of meditation, of yoga, of whatever it is, right? The work of spiritual study, of reading texts, of listening to teachers, all that Virgoan work that occurs in time can make way for those of us who are ready to fully step into this completely other way of knowing and being that we have glimpsed in moments, but that we are preparing to fully embody in a deeper way. And it happens out of time, but the effort that we put in over time helps us to access that timeless reality of spiritual embodiment. And yet it actually is available to anyone, no matter what, no matter how much work they've put in. Theoretically, it's available to anyone in any moment. It's just perhaps more difficult to integrate if you're, say, brand new to spirituality. But then again, some of us have been doing this work for lifetimes, right? So time is weird. And actual spiritual embodiment is not dependent upon time. So some of us are stepping into this whole other way of being. There is really an incredible opportunity right now and over the next few weeks and truly over the next year. We have to be careful not to fall into the delusion of I'm late or there's not enough time. Right? So many of the ways in which we've perceived time also get in the way of our spiritual embodiment. Right? Oh, I missed the chance. The eclipse is past. I missed the moment. No, the moment is always now. It's not about finding some perfect state of happiness. It's not about being in pure bliss and not having any pain and having everything in our life figured out. No. It's about recognizing the divinity in the messiness, in the pain, in the reality of whatever's happening in our life. It's all divine. The potential for Virgo is service to the divine. Right? When it's in relation with Pisces, it knows that all its efforting, all its work, all its service, all its organizing, all its desire for efficiency is in service to the divine, in service to the whole, in service to all that is and to all beings that are, rather than in service to the image of the self as superior, right? There is a potential for Virgo in its disconnected form to feel superior to others, right? That judgmental mode, because it's doing so much work and it's efforting and it's so much better than other people in practical terms. Often, Virgo is better at certain things than other people because it puts in the effort, right? But that's a sort of subtle service to self kind of modality, even though Virgo tends to be very humble, and in part because it often turns that judgmentalness upon itself. So it may not acknowledge its own ego, right? It feels egoless because it's often very humble and can even be subservient in some ways, very willing to work in the background without recognition. But there can sometimes be a sneaky ego, that finds its way in, even through a sort of self-flagellation and critical, judgmental, self-judgmental, often modality. But when it turns that service towards all that is, all beings, right? The interconnectedness, the divinity, then it begins to embody the hermit, the archetype of the hermit, which is self-sufficient, right? Which knows how to find inner peace through solitude, through its work, whatever its work is. And the highest potential for Pisces is to release the illusion of never-ending options, to release the overwhelm of infinite possibility, to release all the energies and expectations and thought patterns and emotions that do not belong to you, right? So to work with the Virgoan practices and energetic hygiene that allows us to release what is not ours, to release that overwhelm and confusion that comes from mistaking our intuitive perception of other people's emotions, thought patterns, baggage, etc., to mistake that perception as perceiving our own feelings, right? To see it, to be able to perceive those energies and release them, to recognize that they are not our own, right? So the discernment of this energy or this thought or this emotion isn't mine. I see it, I perceive it, right? I'm refining my psychic abilities through that clear sight. But I'm learning discernment. I'm learning that that emotion actually doesn't belong to me, and I don't need to keep feeling it or processing it. I can simply release it. And the identification that it is not ours, that discernment is actually enough for it to be released. It's the identification with it that keeps it attached to us. And yes, there are all kinds of practices that are helpful as well, but that discernment is the key thing. When we release this illusion that there are infinite options and know that our knowing will point us exactly in the right direction, then we can find true flow. When we are truly aligned with our intuition and our soul path, there is only one option. There are no options anymore. It's just, this is the path. In every single moment, this is what's true. This is the right move. This is the right perception. This is the right direction. It's not a cognitive knowing. It's an intuitive knowing. It's a flow. It's flowing with the moment, with the current. There's only one direction in which the flow takes us. And that doesn't mean that we've been making mistakes, because all those times in which we tried to go against the flow were simply the way in which we were learning how to follow the flow. So it's not about right or wrong or good or bad, or what was mistaken and what was correct. But it's about when we find alignment, no longer are there infinite possibilities. There's only one path. It's the path that our heart knows as true. People often approach the polarities in astrology, or any polarity for that matter, as through balance, right? Through the idea of balancing the polarity, finding place for this and place for that, right? A little Virgo, a little Pisces. But actually, on a spiritual level, it's not about balance. The ideal is integration. It's not a little of this or a little of that. It's all of both. All the way in with Pisces, all the way in with Virgo, completely integrated. That's the ideal. We're not swinging from one to the other. We're doing both at once, together, simultaneously. That's why in the Tarot, the Temperance card has the esoteric meaning of alchemy. The alchemical process of combining two seemingly disparate elements. What happens when we bring water and fire together? It's not just a little water and a little fire, it's steam. What happens when we bring Pisces and Virgo together? It's not just a little Pisces and a little Virgo, it's enlightenment. I mean, I'm sort of intentionally using that word because we're so used to thinking that that word is reserved for special people, right? For monks who've been meditating for decades. For, a few chosen ones or something. But this way of perceiving enlightenment as so far off and not available to us is what's keeping us from it. Enlightenment is available to every one of us in every moment. And that's on offer here as we collaborate with the energies at play right now. This is a key moment in what some are calling the collective awakening. And I know that some people don't like that way of speaking, and that's okay. But know that your own judgment might be keeping you from the potential of actually experiencing it. And we might even see it as the second coming. And I don't mean that in a fundamentalist kind of way. You know, the esoteric second coming isn't the coming of some single extraordinary human. It's the recognition that what Yeshua showed the world is available for every one of us. We actually can embody unconditional love. Christ consciousness is available for all of us. It's both extraordinary and utterly ordinary. Right? Again, Virgo Pisces. Virgo is so ordinary, but when integrated with Pisces, it's the extraordinary in the ordinary. Now, another potential here is to harness the power of the imagination, Pisces, in an intentional way. So without intention, the imagination can ruminate and be lost in, the conditioning of the mind that goes round and round and tends towards worst case scenario or, sort of cynical, depressive mode, which can see itself as somehow superior again. A misuse of the imagination, when we tend towards allowing the mind to cycle through the conditioned spirals of what it doesn't really want, of what it's been told it is, of taking on other people's projections as our own truth, which keep us in this sort of muddy, confusing loop of the mind. When we can harness that, through the Virgoan discernment and effort, when we can harness the Piscean imagination, we can become the magician. We can begin to set intentions for our day, for our life, for our work, for our projects that miraculously shape whatever it is we were setting the intention for. And again, you can approach this scientifically. Try setting intentions experimentally if you're not ready to believe it and see what happens. And you don't even need to see it in a spiritual way. It's like setting an intention. It somehow organizes the otherwise chaotic flow of possibility and experience and, the infinite movement of molecules. It's like chaotic. But when we set a clear intention, it acts as an organizing force for all that chaos. We truly are creators, but we only are when we believe we are. Because I've walked that road, right? I come from not just a scientific, but a scientistic background. There was a moment when, more than 20 years ago, when I was very materialistic and cynical. And because I've slowly, gradually, although also at times very non-linearly, walked this path, I've been trying to act as a bridge for people who may still be in that mode. But there's something about this period of time where many of us who've been acting as bridges are being called to simply embody this new way, what we've been trying to bridge towards as best we can, right? And this isn't, again, about perfection. So while in the past I may have gone to great lengths to try to explain manifestation in a way that maybe a more cynical mind might be able to grasp, I'm feeling called to more and more stop explaining, stop over-explaining, and to simply speak my truth, accepting that some people won't understand or won't be ready for it or won't be willing to take that leap of faith, because at some point there is a leap required, right? I've been talking about this a lot over the last couple years or few years, especially in the frame of a paradigm shift. And even in that frame, which developed from the sciences, right? The idea comes from Thomas Kuhn, who was a physicist turned philosopher of science, who spoke about paradigm shift in the sciences, right? How, for example, the shift from the Newtonian paradigm to the quantum paradigm is not a gradual transition. It's a total reorganization of the scientific frame, of the scientific worldview, which allows for greater explanatory power. And the same thing is happening now in the collective, where when we finally do transition, it's not a gradual change. Yes, we can walk this bridge so far. You know, we can walk up to the edge of our old paradigm, but at some point, a leap is required. And again, you can approach it scientifically, experimentally. You can say, okay, what happens if I just try taking this leap of faith? You know, what's the worst that can happen if I try it? Some of us are ready. Some of us have already made the leap. Some of us make the leap, you know, multiple times a day. So it's kind of simultaneously gradual and all at once, in the sense that to make the leap is an all or nothing thing. We leap into this new way of knowing and believing, new/old, right? It's the mystical path that mystics have been speaking of for millennia, but new in the sense that it's available for many, many, many more of us now. It's all at once, but it's gradual in the sense that gradually we're learning to make that all at once leap more often. And we're learning how to stay in that mode for longer. And there's a part of me that knows that when I say we really do have the potential to create a reality in a more real way than our previous paradigm allowed for, I know that that will be misunderstood by a lot of people, but I'm no longer feeling called to over-explain it. Although you could go listen to my episode called Advanced Manifestation. I did kind of break some of that down there. So what happens when we really harness our imagination and no longer just let it run around off track, accidentally manifesting things we don't really want because we're so used to ruminating and being cynical and, you know, thinking of all the worst case scenarios and assuming the worst. And we're accidentally manifesting what we don't really want. And it all becomes very muddy. The signal is infected with noise. We can't clearly distinguish the signal of manifestation from the noise of the confusion of the mind cycling and spiraling through what it doesn't really want, through other people's thought patterns, through energies that aren't ours, through, you know, the undisciplined mind that goes in all kinds of different directions. And then what we receive is confusion, because what we've been putting out is confusion. But if we can harness the imagination and trust that we actually are creators, what will happen then? This kind of talk makes some people feel uncomfortable because it appears to be apolitical. It appears to be self-focused and almost like intentionally ignorant of the reality of suffering and injustice. And sometimes, quote-unquote, manifestation has been presented or taught in that way that actually is rather self-focused. But I don't believe that any of this is detached from the reality of pain and suffering and injustice, of the reality of our inherent interconnectedness with all other humans, all other beings, all that is. We've been taught that to be compassionate means to match the energy of those in pain. So there's often the subconscious tendency towards resonating in the same way as those who are suffering. Right? This kind of idea of like, I don't deserve to be happy because other people aren't. I can show compassion by being down there with them in whatever they're feeling. But that's actually quite confused. That's actually not helpful. So this isn't about disconnecting and just like finding our own happiness and ignoring what's going on around us. It's the recognition that how do we respond? How do we respond to the extreme injustice of the structures of power that are currently at play on Earth? What is an effective response? And there are many. The appropriate response will be different for every person. But many of us are recognizing that we don't effectively address that through directly opposing it, although there may be a time and a place for that. But for the most part, to actually create an alternative requires that we embody an alternative way of being and doing and knowing. Many of us are recognizing that what has allowed those obscene, even demonic, forces of power and control to go on their path of destruction and murder and extraction and exploitation and war and genocide. What allows that is a particular worldview. And we actually can't stop that as long as we are operating within the same worldview that created that. So it's the inner work of really, with incredible courage and self-honesty, recognizing what aspects of our own being are actually operating in a very tiny way, but in the same way as those structures of oppression and control. And to learn how to be in an utterly different way. And what I'm suggesting is that this potential leap on offer, especially right now, this leap into a radically different way of knowing and being and doing, in which we recognize divinity in every single moment, in every single person, in which we recognize that we are creators, in which we take our power back, in which we embody actual love, that through that embodiment, we can potentially collectively create alternative structures of power and just governance, which begin through creating alternative structures of thought and worldview that could come to replace the falling, failing structures of the old world, which are desperately acting out and flailing and in their last gasp attempting to maintain the power that they know they are losing, because people are starting to see right through it. People are waking up to the reality of the, literal demonic forces that are in control. But we don't defeat demonic force through force. We defeat it through embodying actual, true, unconditional love. which again is not to allow or accept or excuse that behavior, because we maintain Virgoan discernment even in our true unconditional love. We maintain clear sight. We can clearly see what is ethical and what is not ethical. While and because of embodying true unconditional love. Unconditional love does not have no boundaries. It is not weak. It is the most powerful, the most courageous, the most fierce force in the universe. We've been told that love is meekness, that love means being a doormat, that love means being a martyr, but none of that is love. That's confused. So much of what we've been told is love is not love. It's actually a subtle form of control. Love is fierce. Love does not allow or excuse bad behavior, but it recognizes that that behavior comes from a place of woundedness. That those people doing those despicable things are so disconnected from love, from their heart, from God, from truth, that they must be in so much pain and confusion that they could possibly do those things. That doesn't mean we allow it or accept it. It means that we see the truth at the source of even demonic acts of evil. It's to see that it's only in embodying love that we have any hope of breaking the cycle of violence that has haunted humanity for millennia. There's always been pockets of humans that have found a way to love, but it really is happening on a mass scale right now. And that's why there actually is an opportunity over the coming years for humanity to collectively create an alternative to the system of control that is being implemented at the moment. Right, so I spoke in the last episode about the authoritarianism that is trying to be implemented right now. But that does not mean we are doomed, because at the very same time, there's this crystallizing consciousness in the collective that's truly embodying love and creating the alternative to that proposed authoritarian regime. And it begins with self-love, with self-acceptance, with surrender to the moment, to the circumstances, to the conditions in which we find ourselves. If we can find a way to fully accept that and fully accept ourselves as we are in this place right here and now, we can begin to embody true love. This also asks of us to release fear, which is difficult. Fear appears logical, and it's been conditioned through, millennia of all our lifetimes in these dire circumstances, having to find a way to survive on earth in a body. And, there are times when fear was helpful. But fear is only logical if we are fully identified with our animalistic selves and have fully forgotten that we are also divine souls, right? Fear only makes sense if we have fully forgotten who we really are. Fear only makes sense if we have believed the illusion that we are mortal. So much of the absurdity that we're seeing culturally right now is a distortion of spiritual truth. So this absolutely absurd and backwards attempt at extending life and this desire for immortality that certain ultra wealthy people are striving towards is a utter distortion of the spiritual truth that our souls never die, that death is merely a transformation from one state to another. It's an over-identification with the ego self, right? The ego self. And psychologically, we need an ego. So this isn't about, hating on the ego. But when we mistake the ego for all that we are, then we mistakenly believe that we are who we think we are, right? Some finite, specific thing, rather than an infinite, undefinable, unspeakable soul, that we are creators, that we are God. God isn't something that exists outside of us. God is within every single one of us. So, right, a potential for Pisces is that recognition of our own inner divinity and that we are actually immortal souls and that there isn't anything to fear. We will die at some point, right? Our bodies will die. And when we can really face that and accept it and integrate the truth that our bodies will not exist forever, then we no longer need to fear that. And then we no longer need to fear anything. And then we can be truly powerful in a good way, right? Right use of power is to stand in love and to create from that place. It's both so simple and immediate and always available, right? This state of being. And yet it asks of us some seemingly impossible, perhaps, feats to release fear, to release control, to release doubt, to release confusion, to release our identity with who we think we are, to release our over-attachment to money and material things and all of the fear that swirls around that. If we could experimentally try it, if we could be willing to believe for a moment, we might see that the seemingly impossible is available to us in any moment. What gets in the way often of intuition is worry, those depressive mind loops that present as, necessary. Again, a very Piscean, Virgoan theme. We can convince ourselves that it's logical to be anxious, to worry. We can convince ourselves that that somehow protects us. But it's an illusion that blocks us from love and truth and knowingness. What if we could release fear and worry and confusion and doubt and control? What if we could simply be and trust and love? So simple, so difficult, seemingly difficult, but not actually. We're just so conditioned, so many of us, into thinking that it's not only not possible, but it's foolish, it's naive. But it's only those who haven't experienced it who think that. And that's the most unscientific, illogical, naive way of thinking, to assume that something you haven't experienced or tried is foolish. Let's take our power back and recognize the power of our own imagination and how when we allow our imagination to spiral in fear and worst case scenario, we're actually creating that. So what do we want to create? And how can we work with the imagination in a more intentional way, both for our own lives as well as for the collective? What do we want to create? The possibilities are endless. The future is not fixed. Yeah, there are some potentially very gloomy, scenarios on offer. And we may have to go some of the way down some of those paths in order for more people to see more clearly the direction in which the collectives are heading. But the sooner we can harness our own imaginations and begin to feel into what we actually do want, the more that becomes possible for us. And I don't believe this is about imagining some perfect political system in advance, especially if we imagine, like in the past, unfortunately, so many times people have gone down the path of imagining a beautiful possibility for humanity, only to then impose it through force and violence. Could we allow our imaginations to be imaginative enough to imagine a particular political future in which there might be governance that does not need to be violently imposed upon people? What's required is true leadership. And that begins with each of us embodying leadership through resonating in a way that cultivates new possibilities for humanity, simply through our being. We make way for true leadership in the world by being leaders in our own lives, which is not to tell other people what to do or to presume that we know best or to see ourselves as superior. To be a leader is to be willing to resonate in our own truth, even if no one else understands it. If we want a future in which there's more justice, more freedom, less violence, less suffering, we get there not through violently imposing our will upon others, but through embodying our own truth, through embodying love. True love, which is fucking hard. It's hard to really be actually loving, not just like enmeshed with others and subtly manipulating them through quote unquote love. That's not love. We don't need to explain ourselves anymore. We don't need to justify our decisions. Other people are not going to understand. We have to be willing to step up into our own truth before people around us get it, because this is the cutting edge. And there have been people on the cutting edge already for decades or millennia, right? But on a bigger scale, on a collective scale, there's a wave of us now who are being called to take this leap into the new paradigm, into this completely new, utterly different, reorganized way of being and knowing and doing and thinking. When confusion comes to haunt us, now we can simply say, no, I see you. I don't need you. You're not mine. When worry knocks at our door, we can say, oh, hello, I know you. I love you, but you're no longer welcome here. I have boundaries. I have energetic boundaries. I no longer let fear in. I no longer let confusion in. I no longer let other people's projections of me in. What other people think about me is their business. They can misunderstand me. They can misperceive me. They can make assumptions about me. It's not my problem. My work is to embody my own truth, to exist as best as I can in a state of love. Let us hold to the dream of an awakening humanity that is creating a more peaceful, more beautiful, more just world. Even as we are witnessing outwardly the last throes of an empire, grasping to maintain its power. Outwardly, it appears to be going in the worst direction. outwardly it appears as if things are only getting worse. But we know that we create the future, that we are not at the whim of those who seek to exert their power over us, that we create the future, and that as we recognize our own power and creative potential, as more and more of us wake up to this, that we are creating the future even as there are, these desperate grasps for power, even as, there are people seeking authoritarian control, even as there are incredible, disgusting injustices playing out on the world stage. We know that we are creating the future. It might be several years down the line, right? Because we have to stabilize the frequency inwardly before it can manifest outwardly in a big way on a collective level. So it requires of us incredible faith and trust. So maybe one last thing to say about energetic boundaries, because there are many beautiful practices and meditations for this. But as I said before, intention is the most important thing, and our love is the most important thing. If we truly can embody a frequency of love, which begins with self-love, then we don't have to fear that other energies, whether embodied or disembodied, right? Whether we're talking about beings in the astral realm or other humans, if we are truly embodying a state of love and self-love, we don't need to fear that those energies will be able to get in and manipulate us or impact us in a negative way. Our love acts as a boundary, right? So this happens in a very mundane way when we love ourselves enough to, have physical boundaries. Like if someone comes up to us and starts talking to us and we don't actually want to talk to them, we love ourselves enough to end the conversation and leave. But it happens in the spiritual realm as well, where our love acts as an energetic barrier to lower energies who might seek to disrupt us or distract us or confuse us or leech our energy. So, do any practices you feel called to do, but also know that being in a state of love is energetic protection. When we start to fear entities, that actually creates a path for them to come in. Okay. I think we've talked about plenty for today. We covered a lot of different things, and I didn't fully explain everything as much as I maybe would have in the past. Please let me know in the comments if you'd like clarity on anything I spoke about, or if you have any questions. And I'd be happy to answer any questions in a future episode. I'd be happy to go into any of these themes in more detail. We can go more deeply into energy boundaries, into energetic hygiene, into clearing, into, any of that stuff or anything else that I spoke about. So I always welcome your questions and your comments. I always love to hear from you. And thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate your time, your energy, your attention. For more information, for more content, head on over to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Until next time, take care.